Where are you right now? Scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m., taking a break from work, sitting in traffic wondering how you ended up here? You're in exactly the right place. Go ahead, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade just a little, because tonight we're travelling somewhere quieter, somewhere forgotten, somewhere that predates your morning commute by 5,000 years. This is your corner of the internet, where we dig into the stories that textbooks forgot to tell, the civilizations that rose and fell before anyone thought to write their names in stone. If you're here for the kind of history that makes you question everything you thought you knew about human progress, this might just become your new obsession. We're not talking about Rome or Egypt or the usual suspects. We're talking about the Americas before the Americas had a name, before anyone imagined that cities could exist in jungles, before the very concept of civilization crossed an ocean. So dim your screen, get comfortable, and let's begin. Picture this. It's 1500 BCE. The pyramids of Giza are already ancient, over 1,000 years old. Babylon is thriving along the Euphrates. The Shang dynasty is casting bronze in China. And halfway around the world, in a place that wouldn't be called Mexico for another 3 millennia, something extraordinary is happening in the swamps. Deep in the humid lowlands of what we now call Veracruz, along rivers that flood and recede with the rhythm of seasons, people are doing something unprecedented in the Americas. They're not just surviving, they're not just farming, they're building, they're carving, they're creating art so sophisticated that when archaeologists first found it in the 1930s, they refused to believe it could be that old. Welcome to the world of the Olmec, the people who built America's first cities when most of the world still thought the Americas were empty ocean. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night thinking about this. These weren't just the first cities in Mesoamerica, they were the first cities anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, the first monumental architecture, the first urban planning, the first writing system, the first calendars. While people in Europe were still living in small villages, the Olmec were moving 20-ton blocks of basalt across 50 miles of swampland to build ceremonial centres that would make a pharaoh jealous, and then they vanished. Not slowly, not gradually, but completely. Their cities were abandoned, their monuments buried, their very existence forgotten until archaeologists started pulling colossal heads out of the jungle in the last century. It's as if an entire civilization decided to erase itself from history. The story begins in the most unlikely place imaginable. The Gulf Coast of Mexico, around 3000 BCE, is not where you'd expect to find the cradle of American civilization. It's hot, humid, swampy, prone to flooding, infested with mosquitoes, and generally about as hospitable as a sauna filled with alligators. The soil is rich, yes, but it's also unpredictable. Rivers change course overnight. What's dry land in the morning might be underwater by evening. And yet, this is where it started. Not in the cool highlands, not in the fertile valleys, not in the places where logic says civilization should begin, but here, in the lowlands, in the swamps, where the challenge of survival was so intense that it forged something entirely new. The earliest evidence comes from a site called San Lorenzo. And when I say evidence, I mean the kind that makes archaeologists do double takes and rewrite their textbooks. We're talking about earthworks that required moving hundreds of thousands of tons of soil. We're talking about drainage systems so sophisticated they wouldn't be out of place in a modern city. We're talking about art so refined, so mathematically precise, that it suggests not just individual genius, but entire schools of craftsmen passing knowledge down through generations. But let's start with what you've probably seen, even if you didn't know what you were looking at. The heads, those massive, mysterious stone heads that seem to stare out from museum displays and documentary photographs with an expression that's somehow both serene and unsettling. 17 of them have been found so far, scattered across 3 major Olmec sites, each one carved from a single block of basalt, each one unique, each one clearly representing a specific individual. These aren't generic royal portraits. Look closely at photographs of them, and you'll see something remarkable. Each head has distinct facial features, different expressions, unique details in the elaborate helmets they wear. This one has a slight smile. That one looks stern, almost angry. Another seems to be gazing into the distance with a kind of melancholy wisdom. These are portraits of real people, specific people, people whose faces mattered enough to someone that they commissioned artists to carve them into stone for eternity. And here's what makes your head spin when you really think about it. Each of these heads weighs between 6 and 50 tons. The stone they're carved from doesn't exist anywhere near the sites where they were found. The basalt came from the Tuxtla Mountains, 50 miles away through swampland that has no roads, no navigable rivers, no easy path of any kind. Somehow, using technology we don't fully understand, the Olmec quarried these massive blocks, transported them across terrain that would challenge a modern construction crew, and then carved them with such precision that you can see the individual braids in their hair. Think about the logistics of that for a moment. Think about the planning, the organisation, the sheer number of people required to move a 20-ton block of stone 50 miles through a swamp. Think about the tools, the ropes, the rollers, the coordination required to get it from point A to point B without losing it to quicksand or floodwater. And then think about the artists who looked at that raw block of stone and saw a human face waiting to be freed from the rock. This wasn't the work of scattered tribes or small villages. This was the work of a complex society with specialised labour, hierarchical organisation, and the kind of surplus wealth that allows you to invest massive resources in projects that serve no immediate practical purpose. This was the work of people who had already answered the basic questions of survival and were now asking the deeper questions of meaning, memory, and immortality. But the heads are just the beginning. The more archaeologists excavated at San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, the more it became clear that the Olmec weren't just making art. They were making cities. Cities unlike anything that had existed in the Americas before. Cities that required a level of social organisation and engineering sophistication that shouldn't have been possible in 1500 BCE. San Lorenzo, the oldest and perhaps most impressive of the Olmec centres, sits on a plateau that rises about 150 feet above the surrounding floodplain. But here's the thing that makes archaeologists' eyes light up when they talk about it. It's not a natural plateau, it's artificial. The entire thing was constructed, sculpted, engineered by human hands. 7 square miles of carefully planned urban landscape, with neighbourhoods arranged around ceremonial plazas, elite residences positioned to overlook the common areas, and a drainage system so advanced that it still functions today, 3,500 years later. The drainage system alone is worth pausing over, because it tells us something profound about Olmec engineering capabilities. They didn't just dig ditches and hope for the best. They created an integrated network of stone-lined channels, underground aqueducts, and retention ponds that could handle the massive seasonal floods that regularly inundated the region. They built their city to work with the water, not against it, channeling it where they wanted it to go, storing it when they needed it, and directing it away when they didn't. And this wasn't crude trial and error construction. The stones were cut and fitted with precision. The channels were graded at exactly the right angle to maintain proper flow without erosion. The whole system was planned and executed by people who understood hydraulic engineering at a level that wouldn't be achieved again in Mesoamerica for centuries. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about San Lorenzo is how it was arranged. This wasn't just a random collection of buildings that grew up organically over time. It was designed, planned. The ceremonial centre was positioned at the highest point, surrounded by elite residences that had clear sightlines to the ritual areas. Below them, in carefully organised tiers, were the workshops where artisans created the sculptures, pottery, and ornaments that made Olmec civilization famous. And beyond that, extending out into the floodplain, were the agricultural areas and common residences that supported the entire complex. It's a pattern that would be repeated throughout Mesoamerican history, from the Maya pyramids to the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. The idea that a city should be organized around sacred space with society arranged in concentric circles of decreasing status as you move away from the center. The Olmec didn't just invent this pattern. They perfected it so thoroughly that it became the template for urban planning in the Americas for the next 3,000 years. But who were these people? What did they call themselves? What language did they speak? What did they believe? Here's where the story gets frustrating, because despite all the archaeological evidence, despite all the magnificent art and impressive engineering, the Olmec remain largely silent. They left no written records that we can read, no histories that explain their rise and fall, no mythology that reveals their worldview. What we have instead are clues, hints, fragments of meaning scattered across their art and architecture, like pieces of a puzzle that we're still trying to solve. Look at their art, really look at it, and you start to see patterns emerging from the silence. Jaguars everywhere. Not just any jaguars, but stylized, mythologized jaguars with human features. Jaguar men with snarling faces and clawed hands. Human babies with jaguar mouths. Elite figures wearing jaguar pelts and jaguar masks. The jaguar wasn't just an animal to the Olmec. It was something more, something sacred, something that bridged the gap between the human world and whatever lay beyond it. And then there are the mirrors, polished obsidian mirrors that would have reflected light like black fire, iron ore mirrors that gleamed with metallic perfection. These weren't vanity items. Archaeological evidence suggests they were ritual objects, used in ceremonies we can only guess at. Imagine standing in one of those ceremonial plazas at night, torchlight flickering off polished stone, and seeing your face reflected back from a surface so perfect it seemed to hold depth, seemed to contain another world just behind the glass. The rubber balls tell another story. The Olmec were the first people anywhere to figure out how to make rubber from tree sap, and they used it to create balls for a game that would spread throughout Mesoamerica and survive in various forms for thousands of years. But this wasn't just recreation. The ball courts they built weren't just sports venues. They were sacred spaces where ritual games reenacted cosmic battles between light and darkness, life and death, order and chaos. Think about what that means. These people looked at a bouncing rubber ball and saw the movement of the sun across the sky. They looked at a game and saw a metaphor for the fundamental forces that govern the universe. They weren't just playing, they were participating in the creation of meaning itself. But perhaps the most tantalizing clues come from La Venta, the second great Olmec center, built on an island in the middle of a swamp around 900 BCE. If San Lorenzo was impressive for its engineering, La Venta was stunning for its ambition. The centerpiece was a pyramid over 100 feet tall, made not of stone, but of clay and earth, shaped with mathematical precision and oriented to align with astronomical phenomena. And pyramid! Archaeologists found buried beneath that something that still gives them chills. A massive mosaic floor made of serpentine blocks, each one cut and polished and fitted together to form an intricate geometric pattern. But here's the thing that makes it so haunting. After they finished it, after they spent what must have been months or years creating this masterpiece, they covered it up, buried it under layers of coloured clay, built their pyramid on top of it. It was never meant to be seen by human eyes again. Why? Why create something so beautiful, so complex, so obviously meaningful, and then hide it forever? The only answer that makes sense is that it wasn't meant for human eyes. It was meant for something else, someone else. The gods, perhaps, or the ancestors, or the forces that move beneath the surface of the world. It was an offering, a prayer made manifest in stone, and then given back to the earth. This is where the Olmecs start to feel less like an ancient civilization, and more like something from a dream. They weren't just building cities and making art. They were constructing entire cosmologies, creating physical manifestations of beliefs so deep and complex that we're still trying to understand them 3,000 years later. The writing system they developed adds another layer to the mystery. Yes, they had writing, probably the first in the Americas, centuries before the Maya glyphs, that most people think of as the earliest American script, but Olmec writing is different. Stranger, less linear. It appears on monuments and sculptures not as narrative text, but as isolated symbols that seem to carry enormous weight, enormous meaning, compressed into single glyphs that might represent entire concepts rather than simple words or sounds. One symbol shows up repeatedly across different sites, different time periods. It looks like a stylized hand with what might be an eye in the palm. Another resembles a bird with outstretched wings, but the wings are covered in dots that could represent stars or seeds or drops of rain. A third combines human and plant elements in ways that suggest transformation, metamorphosis, the boundary between life and death becoming fluid and permeable. These aren't random decorations, they're components of a symbolic language that encoded knowledge we've lost. Knowledge about astronomy, about agriculture, about the movement of celestial bodies and the cycles of growth and decay that govern all life. The Olmec weren't just observing the world around them, they were reading it, interpreting it, finding patterns and meanings that they then encoded into art and architecture and ritual, and they were teaching it to others. Because here's what makes the Olmec story even more remarkable. Their influence didn't stay contained within their swampy homeland. It spread throughout Mesoamerica, from the deserts of northern Mexico to the rainforests of Guatemala. Archaeologists find Olmec-style artifacts, Olmec artistic motifs, Olmec religious symbols appearing in local contexts, adapted and modified, but clearly derived from the mother culture in the Gulf Coast lowlands. This wasn't conquest in the traditional sense. There's no evidence of Olmec armies marching across Mesoamerica, imposing their will by force. Instead, it seems to have been something more subtle, more profound. Cultural transmission, ideas spreading along trade routes, carried by merchants and pilgrims and wandering artisans. Religious concepts that were so compelling, so useful, so true to human experience that they took root wherever they landed. The ball game spread this way. The calendar system, the artistic tradition of combining human and animal features to represent supernatural beings. The architectural principle of organising space around sacred centres. The mathematical concepts that allowed for precise astronomical observations. All of these innovations, all of these insights, radiating outward from the Olmec heartland like ripples in a pond. But perhaps the most important thing they transmitted was something even more fundamental. The idea that civilization was possible, that human beings could organise themselves into complex societies, could build monuments that would outlast individual lifetimes, could create art and knowledge and meaning that transcended the immediate needs of survival. Before the Olmec, the Americas were populated by scattered bands of hunter-gatherers and small farming communities. After the Olmec, the template was established. The Maya would build on it. The Zapotec would adapt it. Eventually, the Aztec would take it to its logical conclusion in the great city of Tenochtitlan. But it all started in those unlikely swamps, with those mysterious people who looked at a hostile environment and decided to transform it into something magnificent. And then, around 400 BCE, it ended. Not gradually, not with the slow decline you might expect from a civilization facing external pressures or internal collapse. Suddenly, completely, the great centres were abandoned. The monumental sculpture projects were left unfinished. The trade networks that had carried Olmec influence across a continent simply stopped functioning. What happened? Theories abound, but none of them fully explain the completeness of the abandonment. Climate change? Perhaps, making the already challenging environment impossible to sustain large populations. Social revolution, with the common people rising up against the elite classes who had organised the monumental building projects. Invasion by outside groups, though there's no archaeological evidence of warfare or destruction. Or maybe something else entirely. Maybe the Olmec achieved what they set out to achieve and simply moved on. Maybe their civilization was always intended to be temporary, a seed planted in the soil of history that would sprout into something larger, something that would spread across the Americas and transform the world, because that's exactly what happened. The cities fell silent, the colossal heads stared out over empty plazas, and the jungle began its patient work of reclamation. But the ideas survived. The knowledge survived. The vision of what human society could become survived, carried forward by the peoples who had learned from the Olmec example. 3,000 years later, we're still finding pieces of what they left behind. Not just the obvious monuments, not just the colossal heads that grab headlines and fill museum galleries, but smaller things, more intimate things. Clay figurines no bigger than your thumb, carved with the same precision as the massive stone sculptures. Jade ornaments that required techniques so advanced we're still figuring out how they achieved them. Obsidian blades so sharp they're still used in modern surgery, knapped by craftsmen who understood the molecular structure of volcanic glass better than most materials scientists. These weren't just functional objects, they were statements, declarations of a worldview so sophisticated that every tool, every ornament, every piece of pottery carried layers of meaning that we're only beginning to decode. A simple clay vessel becomes a canvas for complex mythological narratives. A jade axe transforms into a symbol of divine authority. An obsidian mirror becomes a portal between worlds. The level of specialization required to produce these objects tells us something profound about Olmec society. This wasn't a culture where everyone did a little bit of everything. This was a world of experts, master stone carvers, who spent decades learning to read the grain of basalt. Jade workers who could split and polish the hardest stones with tools that shouldn't have been capable of the task. Astronomers who tracked celestial movements with such precision that their calculations remained accurate for centuries. And somewhere, coordinating all of this were the people whose faces ended up carved in stone. The rulers, the priests, the elite who commanded the resources and labour necessary to move mountains. Literally, because that's what they did. They looked at landscapes and decided to rearrange them according to their vision of how the world should be organised. Take Tres Zapotes, the third major Olmec centre, built around 1000 BCE in what is now southern Veracruz. The site sits in a natural valley, but the Olmec weren't content to work within the constraints of existing topography. They terraformed the entire area, creating artificial hills, redirecting waterways, carving channels, and reservoirs that turned seasonal flooding from a disaster into a resource. The engineering required for this kind of landscape modification is staggering. Modern earth-moving equipment would struggle with some of what they accomplished using nothing but human labour, stone tools, and an understanding of physics that they somehow developed without access to the accumulated knowledge of previous civilizations. They were starting from scratch, figuring out principles of hydraulics and structural engineering that wouldn't be formalized in textbooks for thousands of years. But the most remarkable thing about Tres Zapotes isn't the earthworks or the monumental architecture. It's the calendar, carved into a stone monument known as Stela C. Archaeologists found the earliest known date in the Western Hemisphere, September 3rd, 32 BCE, if you convert it to our modern calendar system. But here's what makes your head spin. This isn't just a random date scratched into stone by someone who happened to figure out how to count days. This is part of a sophisticated calendrical system that tracks not just solar years, but lunar cycles, Venus cycles, and complex astronomical phenomena that required centuries of careful observation to understand. The Olmec were keeping time with mathematical precision, while most of the world was still operating on rough seasonal approximations. They knew exactly how long a year was, down to decimal fractions of days. They could predict eclipses, calculate the positions of planets, and correlate celestial events with terrestrial cycles in ways that allowed them to plan agricultural activities, religious ceremonies, and political events with extraordinary accuracy. Think about what that means for a society when you can predict the future, even in limited ways, you become something more than human in the eyes of your people. When you can tell them exactly when the rains will come, when the floods will recede, when the stars will align in patterns that favour certain activities, you're not just a ruler, you're a conduit to the divine. This is where the religious and political aspects of Olmec civilization become impossible to separate. The people who commissioned those colossal heads weren't just secular leaders. They were intermediaries between the human world and the cosmic forces that governed everything, from weather patterns to the growth cycles of maize. They were shamans and kings, priests and politicians, scientists and sorcerers, all rolled into one. The iconography supports this interpretation. Look closely at Olmec art, and you see the same figures appearing again and again, but they're not always entirely human. Sometimes they have jaguar features, sometimes they sprout feathers like birds, sometimes they transform into serpents or crocodiles, or fantastic combinations of multiple animals. These aren't different people being depicted. These are the same people shown in different aspects of their supernatural authority. The jaguar transformation is particularly significant because jaguars were the apex predators of the Mesoamerican world. They hunted at night, moved through water and trees with equal ease, and possessed a kind of preternatural stealth that made them seem almost magical to human observers. To claim jaguar identity was to claim power over the darkness, over the hidden places, over the forces that ordinary people feared. But the Olmec took this symbolism further than anyone before or since. They didn't just wear jaguar masks or jaguar pelts. They created an entire mythology around the idea of were-jaguars, beings that were simultaneously human and feline, rational and instinctual, civilized and wild. And some of their most powerful art depicts infants with jaguar features, suggesting that this transformation wasn't something that happened to adults through ritual or political authority. It was something that could be present from birth, a divine blessing that marks certain individuals as inherently different from the rest of humanity. The rubber ball game fits into this cosmic drama in ways that reveal just how sophisticated Olmec religious thinking really was. The ball courts weren't just entertainment venues, they were theatres where mythological narratives were enacted through athletic competition. The movement of the rubber ball represented the journey of the sun through the underworld. The players weren't just athletes, they were actors in a cosmic play that reenacted the fundamental struggles between light and darkness, life and death, order and chaos. Archaeological evidence suggests that some of these games ended with human sacrifice. Not random violence, but ritualized offerings that were believed to maintain the balance of the universe. The losing team, or perhaps the winning team, depending on the specific ritual context, would give their lives to ensure that the sun continued to rise, that the rains continued to fall, that the cycles of agricultural fertility continued to turn. This sounds brutal to modern sensibilities, and it was, but it was also profoundly logical within the Olmec worldview. If the universe operates according to principles of reciprocity, if the gods give life and fertility to humans, then humans must give something back to maintain the balance. Blood was the most precious thing they had to offer, and they offered it freely, willingly, as part of their responsibility as conscious beings in a conscious cosmos. The ball courts themselves were marvels of acoustic engineering. The sloped walls were designed to amplify and focus sound in specific ways, creating audio effects that enhance the ritual drama of the games. A ball bouncing off the court walls would create rhythmic echoes that could be heard throughout the ceremonial centre. Spectators cheering or chanting would generate resonances that seemed to come from the earth itself. The entire experience was designed to blur the boundaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, to create moments when the presence of the divine became palpable, undeniable. But perhaps the most mysterious aspect of Olmec religion involved their relationship with water. Every major ceremonial centre was built near rivers, springs, or wetlands. Not just for practical reasons, though Access to water was certainly important for large populations. These locations were chosen because water was sacred, a primordial element that connected the earthly realm to the underworld. The Olmec created elaborate rituals around water offerings. Jade objects, obsidian blades, ceramic vessels, even entire sculptures were deliberately deposited in springs and rivers as gifts to the aquatic deities. These weren't random acts of devotion. They were carefully orchestrated ceremonies that required precise timing, specific materials, and elaborate protocols that were passed down through generations of priests. Some of the most spectacular Olmec art comes from these underwater deposits. Jade figurines so perfect they seem to glow within a light, obsidian mirrors polished to supernatural perfection, ceramic vessels decorated with mythological scenes so complex they read like visual encyclopedias of religious knowledge. All of it given to the water, consigned to darkness, offered to forces that human eyes would never see again. Why? What did they think they were accomplishing with these underwater offerings? The only answer that makes sense is that they understood water as a medium of communication with the divine. By placing sacred objects in springs and rivers, they were sending messages to the gods, prayers made manifest in jade and obsidian and fired clay. The cenotes, those natural sinkholes that punctuate the limestone landscape of the Yucatan, played a similar role in later Maya civilization. But the Olmec were working with different geography, different water sources. They had to create their own sacred pools, their own connections to the aquatic underworld. The sophisticated drainage systems at San Lorenzo and La Venta weren't just practical infrastructure. They were religious technology, networks of channels and reservoirs that allowed controlled access to the sacred elements. This integration of practical and spiritual concerns characterizes everything the Olmec did. Their cities weren't just places where people lived and worked, they were cosmological maps, physical representations of their understanding of how the universe was organized. The ceremonial centers at the highest points represented the sky realm. The residential areas in the middle elevations represented the human world. And the water management systems that channeled rivers and controlled flooding represented the underworld, the aquatic realm of death and rebirth. Living in an Olmec city meant participating in this cosmic drama every day. Your house wasn't just a shelter, it was positioned according to religious principles that connected your family to the larger patterns of divine order. The streets you walked weren't just pathways between destinations, they were sacred geometries that aligned with astronomical phenomena and mythological narratives. The water you drank came from systems that had been blessed by priests and consecrated through ritual offerings. This level of integration between daily life and religious meaning created a kind of social cohesion that's almost impossible to imagine in our fragmented modern world. Everyone understood their role in the cosmic order. Everyone participated in the maintenance of divine balance. Everyone was connected to everyone else through shared symbols, shared rituals, shared obligations to the forces that sustain the universe. But it also created a kind of social pressure that may have contributed to the ultimate collapse of Olmec civilization. When religious and political authority are so tightly integrated, when the legitimacy of rulers depends on their ability to maintain cosmic balance, what happens when things go wrong? When the rains fail, when floods destroy crops, when eclipses occur at unexpected times, when the astronomical calculations that validate priestly authority prove inaccurate. The archaeological record suggests that, toward the end of the Olmec period, around 400 BCE, there was increasing social tension. Monuments were defaced, colossal heads were deliberately buried or mutilated, sacred sculptures were broken and scattered. This wasn't random vandalism, it was systematic destruction of the symbols of divine authority, suggesting that the people had lost faith in the cosmic order that the elite claimed to maintain. But even as the political structure collapsed, Even as the great ceremonial centres were abandoned, the ideas survived. The calendar systems were adopted by later civilizations. The artistic traditions were modified and continued. The religious concepts were adapted to new circumstances and new landscapes. The ball games spread throughout Mesoamerica and survived in various forms until the Spanish conquest. Most importantly, the fundamental insight that made Olmec civilization possible, the idea that human society could be organized around sacred principles, that cities could be built as expressions of cosmic order, that art and architecture could serve as bridges between the earthly and divine realms. This insight became the foundation for everything that followed in Mesoamerican history. The Maya took it and created the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Zapotec adapted it to their mountain valleys and developed new forms of monumental architecture. The people of Teotihuacan used it to build a city larger than Rome. Eventually, the Aztec would synthesize all of these traditions into an empire that stretched from coast to coast. But it all started in the swamps, with people who looked at an impossible landscape and decided to transform it into something sacred, with artists who could see human faces in blocks of basalt, with engineers who could move mountains using nothing but human labour and mathematical precision, with priests who could read the movements of stars and translate them into earthly calendars, with the Olmec, who built the first cities in the Americas, and then walked away from them, leaving behind only stone faces staring out over empty plazas, waiting for archaeologists to rediscover their secrets 3,000 years later. And yet, for all their achievements, for all the monuments and mysteries they left behind, there's something deeply unsettling about trying to understand the Olmec mind. Because when you strip away the academic language, when you stop talking about complex societies and monumental architecture and sophisticated iconography, what you're left with is a simple, haunting fact. These people thought differently than we do. Not just culturally different, not just technologically different, cognitively different. They inhabited a world where the boundary between symbol and reality was fluid, where a jade figurine wasn't just a representation of a god, but could actually become the god under the right circumstances, where mathematical calculations about planetary movements were simultaneously practical astronomy and sacred prophecy. This isn't primitive thinking. This isn't some evolutionary stage that we've outgrown on our march toward modernity. This is a completely different way of organising consciousness, a different way of passing experience, a different way of being human. And we've lost access to it so completely that we can barely imagine what it felt like from the inside. Consider their approach to time. We think of time as linear, flowing from past to future in a straight line, that we measure with clocks and calendars. The Olmec thought of time as cyclical, as nested wheels within wheels, where the past and future were equally present in any given moment. Their calendar wasn't just a way of keeping track of days, it was a map of eternity, a tool for navigating the eternal return of cosmic patterns. When an Olmec priest calculated that a particular combination of celestial events would recur in exactly 584 days, he wasn't just making an astronomical prediction, he was identifying a moment when the past would literally return, when the same spiritual forces that had been active centuries earlier would become active again, when the same rituals would have the same effects, when the same prayers would reach the same ears. This is why their art seems to exist outside of normal time. Those colossal heads don't depict historical individuals in the way we understand history. They depict eternal archetypes, faces that belonged simultaneously to specific rulers and to the cosmic principles those rulers embodied. The person carved in stone might have died centuries ago, but the force he represented was still present, still active, still accessible through the proper rituals and offerings. The rubber ball game operates according to this same logic. It's not just a reenactment of mythological events, it's a way of making those events happen again, of collapsing the distance between mythical time and historical time until they become indistinguishable. When the ball bounces off the court walls, it's simultaneously a physical object, following the laws of physics, and the sun god journeying through the underworld. Both descriptions are equally true, equally real, equally important. This kind of thinking allowed the Olmec to accomplish things that seem impossible from our materialist perspective. When you believe that consciousness and matter are fundamentally interconnected, when you believe that symbols can influence reality as directly as physical actions, when you believe that human intention can shape cosmic forces, then moving 20-ton blocks of stone across 50 miles of swampland stops being just an engineering problem. It becomes a spiritual practice, a form of prayer made manifest in organised human effort. The logistics still mattered, obviously. They still had to figure out ropes and rollers and leverage points. They still had to coordinate hundreds of workers and plan for seasonal floods and calculate load-bearing capacities. But these practical concerns existed within a larger framework of meaning that gave the entire enterprise a kind of sacred urgency that we can barely comprehend. Imagine being part of one of those stone-moving expeditions. You're not just a labourer performing a job, you're a participant in a cosmic drama, a necessary component in a ritual that will maintain the balance between heaven and earth. The weight of the stone on your shoulders isn't just physical burden, it's sacred responsibility. The ache in your muscles isn't just discomfort, it's offering, sacrifice, prayer made flesh. When the stone finally reaches its destination, when it's carved into the face of a ruler, or the body of a were-jaguar, or the complex geometric patterns that encode astronomical data, you've been part of something that transforms raw matter into meaning. You've helped create an object that will serve as a bridge between worlds, a focal point for rituals that haven't been invented yet, a monument that will outlast your great-grandchildren and carry your prayers into a future you'll never see. This is the mindset that built La Venta's buried mosaic floor, that masterpiece of serpentine blocks fitted together in patterns so complex they read like mathematical poetry. The people who created it weren't thinking about posterity or archaeological preservation. They were thinking about the gods who lived beneath the earth, the forces that needed to be honoured and appeased and given beautiful things to contemplate in their darkness. The fact that they covered it up immediately after completion makes perfect sense within this framework. The floor wasn't meant to be seen by human eyes because it wasn't made for human eyes. It was made for the earth spirits, the serpent deities, the aquatic forces that controlled fertility and flooding, and the mysterious processes that turned seeds into harvests. Covering it with clay wasn't destruction, it was delivery, the final step in a complex ritual that sent their offering into the realm where it belonged. We found it by accident 3,000 years later, using ground-penetrating radar and careful excavation techniques. We photographed it, measured it, analysed the mineral composition of each block, published papers about its construction methods and possible symbolic meanings. But we've never seen it the way its creators intended it to be seen, which is to say, we've never not seen it. We've never experienced the pure act of faith required to create something perfect, and then give it away immediately, forever. This is what I mean when I say the Olmec thought differently than we do. Our relationship with objects is based on possession, preservation, display. We make things to have them, to show them, to pass them down to our children. The Olmec made things to give them away, to the gods, to the earth, to forces that existed beyond the reach of human senses. Their greatest art was never meant to be admired. It was meant to be consumed, absorbed, integrated into the cosmic processes that kept the world functioning. The jade offerings found in cenotes and springs throughout the Olmec heartland tell the same story. These weren't casual donations, spare objects that people could afford to lose. These were treasures, heirlooms, sacred artifacts that represented enormous investments of time and skill and resources. Some of the jade came from sources hundreds of miles away. Some of the carving techniques required tools and expertise that took decades to master. Some of the designs encoded religious knowledge that was passed down through generations of priests, and they threw it all into dark water, into springs and rivers, and flooded caves where no human would ever see it again. Not reluctantly, not as desperate gestures during times of crisis, but regularly, systematically, as part of ongoing relationships with the aquatic deities who controlled the life-giving properties of water. Think about what that means for a society's relationship with wealth, with status, with the accumulation of beautiful objects, the most valuable things you own, the items that mark your family's prestige and connect you to the sacred traditions of your ancestors. These aren't things you keep, these are things you give away, offerings that demonstrate your understanding of the proper relationship between the human world and the divine forces that sustain it. This isn't poverty or asceticism. The Olmec weren't rejecting material culture, they were embedding it so deeply in spiritual practice that the distinction between sacred and secular disappeared entirely. Every object was potentially sacred, every transaction was potentially ritual, every act of creation was potentially prayer. The workshops where Olmec artisans created their masterpieces weren't just craft centres, they were temples, spaces where the transformation of raw materials into meaningful objects took on religious significance. The master carvers who could read the grain of basalt and see faces waiting to be freed weren't just skilled technicians. They were shamans, intermediaries who could communicate with the spirits that lived inside stones and convince them to take on human forms. The apprenticeship system that trained these master craftsmen was simultaneously practical education and spiritual initiation. Learning to carve jade wasn't just about developing hand-eye coordination and understanding the properties of different minerals. It was about developing the kind of consciousness that could perceive the hidden life in seemingly inert matter, the kind of sensitivity that could feel when a stone was ready to be worked and when it needed to rest. This integration of technical skill and spiritual awareness created a tradition of craftsmanship that has never been equalled in the Americas. Olmec jade work is so sophisticated that modern lapidaries using diamond-tipped tools and high-speed rotary equipment struggle to replicate their techniques. Somehow, using stone tools and abrasive powders, they achieved levels of precision that seem to violate the basic principles of what should be possible with Paleolithic technology. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe the technology wasn't Paleolithic at all. Maybe it was something else entirely, a fusion of material technique and consciousness manipulation that we've lost the ability to understand. Maybe the Olmec jade workers weren't just using tools to shape stone. Maybe they were using consciousness itself as a tool, focused intention as a cutting implement, spiritual resonance as a polishing compound. This sounds mystical, unscientific, but consider the alternative. Either the Olmec had access to advanced technology that left no archaeological trace, or they developed techniques based on principles we don't recognize. Principles that integrated physical manipulation with mental states in ways that our materialist worldview doesn't allow for. The astronomical observations encoded in their calendar system point toward the same conclusion. The level of mathematical precision required to track planetary cycles over centuries, to predict eclipses, to correlate lunar and solar calendars. This level of precision shouldn't have been achievable without telescopes, without writing systems for recording observations, without institutional continuity that could preserve data across multiple generations. And yet they did it somehow, using methods we can't reconstruct because we can't imagine the kind of consciousness that would make those methods possible. Maybe they didn't need to write down their observations because they could remember them with perfect accuracy. Maybe they didn't need telescopes because they could see celestial movements with enhanced perception. Maybe they didn't need institutional continuity because they could access information directly from the cosmic patterns themselves. This isn't New Age fantasy. This is the only explanation that accounts for the archaeological evidence without requiring technologies that should have left more extensive traces. The Olmec achieved things that our science says should be impossible using methods that our science doesn't recognize as valid. Either our science is incomplete, or the Olmec were operating according to principles that transcend the limitations of purely physical causation. The colossal heads themselves suggest this kind of expanded capability. Each one is carved from a single block of basalt, but the faces aren't generic or stylized. They're portraits, specific individuals with distinct features, personal expressions, unique details that suggest the carvers were working from direct observation. But here's the problem. The stone came from quarries 50 miles away from where the finished heads were found. Did they carve the faces at the quarry sites and then transport completed sculptures through the swamps? The logistics would be nightmarish. The risk of damage would be enormous. A single crack, a single slip during transport, and months or years of work would be ruined. Did they transport blank blocks and carve them at the destination sites? But then, how did they ensure such precise portraiture without the subjects present during the carving process? Or maybe, just maybe, they had access to techniques that allowed them to work with stone in ways we don't understand. Ways that integrated physical manipulation with consciousness projection. Ways that made distance irrelevant, because the carver's awareness could be present simultaneously at the quarry site and the portrait site, and any point in between. This sounds impossible until you remember that consciousness itself is impossible according to strict materialist principles. The fact that subjective experience arises from objective neural activity is already a mystery that science hasn't solved. Maybe the Olmec developed techniques for expanding and directing consciousness in ways that we've forgotten, ways that allowed them to accomplish feats that seem supernatural from our limited perspective. The sudden abandonment of their cities starts to make sense within this framework. If Olmec civilization was built around practices that required specific states of consciousness, specific techniques for integrating spiritual and material concerns, then the loss of those techniques would make the entire system unsustainable. You can't maintain cities designed as cosmic maps if you've lost the ability to read the cosmos. You can't operate drainage systems blessed by aquatic deities if you've lost the ability to communicate with those deities. Maybe the Olmec didn't disappear because of climate change, or social revolution, or foreign invasion. Maybe they disappeared because they lost access to the expanded states of consciousness that made their civilization possible in the first place. Maybe the techniques were too fragile, too dependent on specific individuals, or specific environmental conditions, or specific cultural practices that couldn't survive the natural entropy of historical change. Or maybe they didn't disappear at all. Maybe they just stopped building monuments and moved into ways of life that leave fewer archaeological traces. Maybe they're still here, still practicing the techniques that made their ancestors capable of impossible achievements, still maintaining the cosmic balance through methods that our science doesn't recognize as significant. The contemporary indigenous peoples of the Gulf Coast region certainly retain knowledge and practices that echo Olmec themes. The same emphasis on water as a sacred element, the same integration of astronomical observation with agricultural cycles, the same understanding of consciousness as something that can be expanded, directed, shaped through ritual practice and disciplined attention. Maybe the Olmec legacy isn't found in the ruins of their abandoned cities. Maybe it's found in the living traditions that have preserved their essential insights across 3 millennia of cultural change. Maybe the colossal heads aren't monuments to dead rulers. Maybe they're markers, signposts pointing toward possibilities for human consciousness that we've barely begun to explore. Because that's the real mystery of the Olmec, isn't it? Not how they moved those massive stones, or carved those perfect faces, or calculated those precise calendars. The real mystery is how they became the kind of people who could conceive of such projects in the first place, who could look at raw matter and see it as the raw material for meaning, who could organize human society around the maintenance of cosmic harmony. They weren't more intelligent than we are. Their brains were the same size as ours, organized according to the same basic principles. But they were using those brains differently, accessing capabilities that we've trained ourselves not to recognize, developing relationships with reality that we've forgotten how to maintain. The question isn't just what happened to the Olmec. The question is what happened to us. How did we become the kind of people who can reconstruct their drainage systems but can't imagine why anyone would bury a perfect mosaic floor immediately after creating it? How did we become so skilled at analysing their astronomical calculations but so unable to comprehend the consciousness that made those calculations meaningful? Maybe the Olmec weren't the beginning of something that was lost. Maybe they were an example of something that's still possible, still available, still waiting for the right combination of circumstances to emerge again. Maybe their abandoned cities aren't monuments to dead civilizations. Maybe they're invitations, challenges, demonstrations of what human beings can accomplish when they stop thinking of consciousness and matter as separate phenomena. The jungle has reclaimed most of their sites now. Vines grow through the drainage channels. Trees root in the ceremonial plazas. The colossal heads stare out through curtains of vegetation at landscapes that have returned to wilderness. But the patterns they encoded in stone and jade and astronomical observations, those patterns are still there, still functional, still waiting for minds capable of reading them correctly. And somewhere in the swamps of Veracruz, in the springs and cenotes where they deposited their most precious offerings, the jade figurines still rest in dark water, still carrying their prayers to the aquatic deities, still maintaining whatever cosmic balance they were designed to preserve. 3,000 years later, still working, still effective, still bridging the gap between human intention and divine response, still waiting for us to remember what we forgot when we decided that consciousness and matter exist in separate realms, when we convinced ourselves that symbols are just representations instead of active forces, when we started thinking of ourselves as observers of the universe instead of participants in its ongoing creation. The Olmec built the first cities in the Americas and then walked away from them, but maybe they didn't really leave. Maybe they just moved into territories that our archaeology can't map, into ways of being that our science can't measure, into relationships with reality that our philosophy can't accommodate. Maybe they're still there, in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to discover, waiting for the rest of us to catch up. And yet, as we sit here 3 millennia later, scrolling through our phones and wondering why ancient mysteries feel more compelling than our modern certainties, there's something else lurking beneath the Olmec story, something that makes your skin crawl when you really think about it. Because what if they didn't walk away at all? What if what we're calling abandonment was actually transformation? What if the people we call the Olmec simply evolved beyond the need for stone monuments and ceremonial centres, beyond the need to leave traces that our archaeology could recognise? Think about it. Every few centuries, the Olmec sites show evidence of renovation, expansion, modification. New layers built on top of old ones, different artistic styles emerging and disappearing, different approaches to the same fundamental problems of organising human society around cosmic principles. This wasn't a static civilization that suddenly collapsed. This was a dynamic system that was constantly changing, constantly adapting, constantly experimenting with new ways of being human. And then, around 400 BCE, the experimental phase ended. Not with destruction, not with collapse, but with completion. The monuments were finished, the cosmic maps were drawn, the calendrical calculations were perfected. The relationship between human consciousness and divine forces was established and stabilized. What need was there to keep building? What purpose would more colossal heads serve once the essential archetypes had been carved into stone? Maybe the Olmec achieved what they set out to achieve and simply graduated to a different kind of existence. Maybe they stopped building cities because they learned how to build something more sophisticated than cities. Maybe they stopped carving monuments because they learned how to carve reality itself into the shapes they needed. The contemporary Huichol people of western Mexico have a saying: the gods don't live in temples, they live in the spaces between thoughts. Maybe the Olmec discovered this truth and decided that stone temples were training wheels, useful for beginners, but ultimately unnecessary for practitioners who had mastered the art of consciousness manipulation. This would explain why their influence spread so far beyond their geographic boundaries. Ideas don't need to be carried by armies or imposed by conquest when they're true enough to be irresistible. The Olmec innovations, the calendar systems and ball game rituals and artistic techniques spread throughout Mesoamerica because they worked. They provided practical solutions to the fundamental problems of human existence: how to organize time, how to maintain social cohesion, how to establish meaningful relationships with the forces that control fertility and weather and the cycles of life and death. But maybe the most important thing they transmitted wasn't any specific technique or practice. Maybe it was the demonstration that human consciousness is far more flexible and powerful than we normally assume. Maybe they showed other peoples that the boundaries we take for granted, the distinctions between subject and object, between symbol and reality, between human and divine, maybe these boundaries are optional. Maybe they can be dissolved, transcended, rearranged according to need and circumstance. The Maya certainly learned this lesson. Their civilization lasted for over 2,000 years, surviving droughts and wars and social upheavals that would have destroyed societies built on purely material foundations. But Maya cities weren't just collections of buildings, they were living mandalas, physical representations of cosmological principles that could be modified and adapted as circumstances changed. When one ceremonial centre was no longer suitable, they built another one. When political conditions shifted, they rearranged the sacred geography. When astronomical observations revealed new patterns, they updated their architectural layouts to reflect the new understanding. This flexibility, this willingness to treat even the most sacred traditions as provisional and subject to revision, this comes directly from the Olmec example. The idea that human society should be organized around cosmic principles, yes, but also the understanding that those principles are dynamic, alive, responsive to human consciousness and intention. The Zapotec took the same insights and applied them to different landscapes, different ecological challenges. Their mountain cities like Monte Alban were built according to the same basic template as the Olmec centers, with ceremonial areas at the highest elevations and residential zones arranged in descending order of status. But they modified the pattern to work with steep terrain and different water sources. They developed new architectural techniques, new artistic styles, new ways of encoding astronomical data into monumental sculpture. Eventually, Teotihuacan would take these principles to their logical conclusion, creating a city larger than Rome, organized around a single, massive ceremonial boulevard that aligned with celestial phenomena and mythological narratives. The Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, all positioned according to calculations that trace back to Olmec astronomical observations, all designed to serve as interfaces between human consciousness and cosmic forces. And then the Aztec, synthesizing traditions from across Mesoamerica, would build Tenochtitlan as the ultimate expression of the Olmec vision. A city that was simultaneously a practical urban center and a three-dimensional cosmological map. Every street, every building, every canal positioned according to principles that integrated practical urban planning with mythological geography. The Great Temple at the center wasn't just a religious monument, it was the axis mundi, the point where all the cosmic forces converged, the heart of a universe that had been consciously designed and continuously maintained through human ritual activity. But here's what keeps me awake at night. thinking about all of this. The Aztec Empire, for all its sophistication and power, lasted less than 2 centuries. Teotihuacan, despite being larger than any European city of its time, was abandoned after 600 years. The Maya cities, individually, rarely survived more than a few centuries before being superseded by new centres built according to updated cosmic maps. Only the Olmec pattern endures. 3,000 years later, we're still finding new applications for their fundamental insights. Not just in Mesoamerica, but everywhere human beings have tried to organise society around something more meaningful than pure material accumulation. The idea that cities should be sacred spaces. The idea that human labour should serve cosmic purposes. The idea that consciousness and matter are fundamentally interconnected phenomena that can be shaped through focused intention and collective ritual activity. These aren't primitive superstitions that we've outgrown in our march toward modernity. These are sophisticated technologies for organising human consciousness and social behaviour that we're only beginning to understand. The Olmec weren't the crude beginning of something that later civilizations perfected. They were the mature expression of possibilities that we've largely forgotten how to access. Consider their approach to leadership, for example. The people whose faces were carved into those colossal heads weren't just political rulers or military commanders. They were living links between the human community and the cosmic forces that sustained it. Their authority came not from wealth or violence or hereditary privilege, but from their demonstrated ability to maintain the balance between earthly needs and divine requirements. This is a completely different model of governance than anything we're familiar with in the modern world. We elect leaders based on their promises to manage economic systems or defeat military enemies or navigate political negotiations. The Olmec selected leaders based on their capacity to serve as intermediaries between different levels of reality, their ability to translate cosmic principles into practical social policies. When an Olmec ruler decided to move those 20-ton blocks of basalt across 50 miles of swampland, he wasn't just commissioning a public works project. He was orchestrating a ritual that would demonstrate the community's collective capacity to transform matter through organised consciousness. The physical achievement, impressive as it was secondary to the spiritual accomplishment of proving that human intention, properly focused and collectively channeled, could reshape the material world according to divine specifications. The colossal heads aren't portraits of dead kings, they're instruction manuals for future rulers, demonstrations of what human consciousness looks like when it's fully aligned with cosmic principles. Each face represents a different aspect of the enlightened awareness required to maintain the balance between heaven and earth. This one shows the fierce concentration needed to channel divine wrath. That one displays the serene compassion required to nurture agricultural fertility. Another demonstrates the playful wisdom that transforms cosmic chaos into creative order. Together, they form a complete curriculum for consciousness development, a stone library that teaches the fundamental skills required for cosmic citizenship. Anyone who spent enough time studying these faces, really looking at them, meditating on the states of awareness they represent, would gradually develop the same capacities in themselves. This is why they were so important to the Olmec, that they invested enormous resources in creating and transporting and positioning them with such precision. They weren't just art, they weren't just political propaganda, they were technological devices for consciousness transformation, tools for developing the kinds of awareness that made Olmec civilization possible, and they're still functional. 3,000 years later, those faces still carry the same information, still radiate the same qualities of consciousness, still serve as bridges between ordinary human awareness and the expanded states that allow direct perception of cosmic patterns. The people who carved them built them to last not just physically, but psychologically, spiritually, as permanent resources for anyone who needed to remember what human beings are capable of when they stop limiting themselves to purely material concerns. The jade workshops where Olmec artisans created their masterpieces operated according to the same principles. These weren't just craft centres where skilled technicians produced luxury goods for elite consumption. They were laboratories for consciousness research, spaces where the fundamental relationships between mind and matter were explored through direct experimentation. The process of transforming raw jade into finished objects wasn't just about developing manual dexterity or learning the properties of different minerals. It was about learning to perceive the hidden life in seemingly inert substances, developing the sensitivity required to feel when a stone was ready to be worked and when it needed to rest, cultivating the kind of awareness that could communicate directly with the molecular structures that determine how materials respond to human intention. Master jade workers weren't just craftsmen. They were shamans who had learned to extend their consciousness into the realm of mineral intelligence, to participate directly in the processes that organize matter into increasingly complex and meaningful forms. The objects they created weren't just beautiful. They were alive, conscious, capable of serving as focal points for ongoing relationships between human awareness and the cosmic forces that govern transformation and growth. This is why Olmec jade work is so extraordinarily sophisticated that modern lapidaries struggle to replicate their techniques. They weren't just using physical tools to shape physical materials. They were using consciousness itself as a cutting instrument, focused attention as a polishing compound, spiritual resonance as a design principle that could guide matter into forms that expressed cosmic harmonies with mathematical precision. The underwater deposits where these jade masterpieces were deliberately placed weren't random offerings or desperate gestures during times of crisis. They were precise installations of consciousness technology in locations where they could serve ongoing functions in the maintenance of cosmic balance. Each jade figurine, each obsidian mirror, each ceramic vessel was positioned according to calculations that took into account water flow patterns, seasonal variations, geological formations, and the invisible energy networks that connect sacred sites across vast distances. The cenotes and springs where these objects were deposited weren't just bodies of water. They were portals, access points to the aquatic underworld where the most fundamental life-giving processes originated. By placing their most precious creations in these locations, the Olmec were establishing permanent communication links with the forces that control fertility, weather, and the cycles of death and rebirth that sustain all life. And those communication links are still active. The jade figurines still rest in dark water, still carrying their original prayers to the aquatic deities, still serving as anchors for whatever cosmic balance they were designed to maintain. 3,000 years later, they're still working, still functional, still connecting human intention to divine response through technologies that our science doesn't recognize as valid but can't prove to be ineffective. This is the real legacy of the Olmec, not the monuments and sculptures that fill our museums, impressive as they are, not the calendar systems and astronomical observations that demonstrate their intellectual sophistication. The real legacy is the demonstration that human consciousness is far more powerful and flexible than we normally assume, that the boundaries between mind and matter are more permeable than our materialist worldview allows for, that the relationship between human intention and cosmic response is more direct and immediate than our scientific methods can measure. They built the first cities in the Americas and then walked away from them, but they didn't disappear. They just moved into territories that our archaeology can't map, into ways of being that our instruments can't detect, into relationships with reality that our philosophy can't accommodate. They're still here, in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to discover, waiting for the rest of us to remember what we forgot when we decided that consciousness and matter exist in separate realms. Because that's the choice we made, isn't it? Somewhere along the way, we decided that the universe is made of dead matter, governed by mechanical laws, that consciousness is just an accidental byproduct of neural activity, that human beings are isolated subjects observing an objective world that exists independently of our awareness of it. We decided that symbols are just representations, that rituals are just customs, that the sacred is just a category mistake made by people who didn't understand the difference between subjective experience and objective reality. And maybe we were wrong. Maybe the Olmec understood something about the nature of existence that we've trained ourselves to forget. Maybe consciousness and matter are two aspects of a single phenomenon. Maybe symbols can influence reality as directly as physical actions. Maybe human intention can shape cosmic forces through focused attention and collective ritual activity. Maybe the colossal heads aren't just sculptures. Maybe they're still conscious, still watching, still waiting for human beings to remember how to see through eyes that aren't limited by the assumption that awareness and matter exist in separate domains. Maybe the jade offerings are still active, still maintaining whatever balance they were created to preserve, still connecting our world to forces that our science can't measure, but our ancestors knew how to work with directly. Maybe the Olmec cities weren't abandoned. Maybe they just moved into dimensions that our three-dimensional archaeology can't access, into time streams that our linear chronology can't follow, into states of being that our materialist categories can't contain. Maybe they're still there, still functional, still serving their original purposes as interfaces between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence. Maybe the real question isn't what happened to the Olmec. Maybe the real question is what happened to us, and whether we can find our way back to the expanded awareness that made their impossible achievements not just possible, but inevitable, because the stone faces are still there, still carrying the same information, still radiating the same qualities of consciousness that allowed the Olmec to move mountains with human hands and mathematical precision. The astronomical alignments are still functional, still connecting earthly events to celestial patterns with the same accuracy that guided their agricultural cycles and ceremonial calendars. The sacred sites are still sacred, still serving as portals between different levels of reality for anyone who knows how to approach them with the proper attitude and preparation. The technology is still there, the knowledge is still there, the possibilities are still there. All that's missing is the consciousness capable of recognizing them, the awareness flexible enough to work with principles that integrate mind and matter into unified fields of creative potential. All that's missing is us. And maybe that's exactly what the Olmec knew would happen. Maybe they encoded their essential insights into forms so durable, so precisely calibrated, so perfectly designed that they would survive any amount of cultural forgetting and still be available when human consciousness evolved enough to recognize them again. Maybe the colossal heads aren't monuments to the past. Maybe they're invitations to the future, demonstrations of what we can become when we stop limiting ourselves to the narrow bandwidth of awareness that our current civilization mistakes for the full spectrum of human possibility. Maybe the buried mosaic floors and underwater jade offerings aren't archaeological curiosities. Maybe they're still active components of a planetary consciousness-raising system that's been operating continuously for 3,000 years, waiting for enough human beings to remember how to participate in its ongoing function. Maybe the Olmec didn't build the first cities in the Americas and then disappear. Maybe they built the first cities in the Americas and then became something else entirely, something that transcends the need for physical monuments, because it learned how to work directly with the consciousness that monuments are designed to evoke and focus and transmit across generations. Maybe they're still here. Maybe they never left. Maybe they're just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. The rubber ball courts scattered throughout the Olmec heartland tell a story that goes deeper than sport, deeper than ritual, deeper than anything we've trained ourselves to recognize as significant. These weren't just playing fields. They weren't even just ceremonial spaces. They were acoustic laboratories, precision-engineered chambers where sound itself became a tool for consciousness transformation. Stand in one of these courts today, clap your hands, and listen to what happens. The sound doesn't just echo, it transforms. The sloped walls, the specific angles, the carefully calculated proportions create resonances that seem to emerge from the earth itself. A rubber ball bouncing against stone generates rhythms that pulse through your chest cavity, that synchronize with your heartbeat, that induce states of awareness you didn't know were possible. The Olmec understood something about sound that we're only beginning to rediscover. They knew that certain frequencies, certain rhythmic patterns, certain acoustic environments could shift consciousness as reliably as any chemical compound. The ball courts weren't just venues for mythological reenactments. They were consciousness-altering devices, architectural instruments designed to produce specific psychological states in everyone who participated in or witnessed the games. Think about what that means for understanding Olmec society. Every major ceremonial centre had at least one ball court. Some had several. These weren't luxury amenities for elite entertainment. They were essential infrastructure, as necessary to the functioning of an Olmec city as the drainage systems or the astronomical observation platforms. Which means that altered states of consciousness weren't occasional religious experiences reserved for special occasions. They were regular features of daily life, built into the very architecture of Olmec civilization. The players weren't just athletes, they were consciousness technicians, trained specialists who understood how to use physical movement, rhythmic patterns, and acoustic resonance to induce specific states of awareness in themselves and in the spectators who gathered to witness their performances. The games weren't competitions in our modern sense, they were collective rituals where entire communities participated in consciousness-raising exercises that reinforced social cohesion and maintained the cosmic balance that Olmec civilization depended on. But here's where it gets really interesting. The rubber itself, that bouncing ball that gave the game its distinctive character, this wasn't just a clever use of available materials. The Olmec were the first people anywhere to figure out how to process tree sap into rubber, a technological achievement that required sophisticated understanding of chemistry, temperature control, and material properties. They could have used this knowledge to create waterproof containers, flexible tools, any number of practical applications. Instead, they made balls. Balls that bounced in ways that defied the normal behaviour of objects, that seemed to possess a life of their own, that moved according to principles that bridged the gap between physical laws and spiritual forces. When you're watching a rubber ball carom off stone walls in patterns that seem almost alive, almost intelligent, it's not hard to understand why the Olmec saw this as a sacred activity, a direct interaction with forces that existed beyond the reach of ordinary human experience. The courts themselves were oriented according to astronomical principles, aligned with solstices and equinoxes and the movements of Venus. This wasn't coincidence. The games were timed to coincide with celestial events, creating moments when the earthly drama of the bouncing ball synchronized with the cosmic drama of planetary movements. Players and spectators weren't just participating in a local ritual, they were participating in the ongoing creation of reality itself, using focused intention and collective attention to maintain the harmony between terrestrial and celestial forces. Archaeological evidence suggests that some games ended with human sacrifice, but this wasn't random violence or primitive bloodlust. It was precise ritual technology, carefully calibrated offerings designed to maintain the reciprocal relationship between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence. The blood wasn't spilled in anger or fear. It was offered freely, willingly, by individuals who understood their deaths as necessary contributions to the ongoing stability of the universe. We find this disturbing because we've forgotten what it means to live in a universe where consciousness and matter are fundamentally interconnected, where human intention can influence cosmic processes, where individual sacrifice can serve collective purposes that transcend the boundaries of single lifetimes. But the Olmec lived in such a universe, and they developed technologies for working with its principles that we've lost the ability to comprehend. The mirrors found at Olmec sites provide another glimpse into these lost technologies. Not just polished surfaces for checking your appearance, but precision optical instruments made from obsidian and iron ore that could focus light, create visual effects, induce altered states through controlled reflection and refraction. Some of these mirrors are so perfectly crafted that they seem to defy the limitations of Stone Age technology. The surfaces are flatter than anything achievable with hand tools, polished to perfection that rivals modern optical equipment. But they weren't just technological marvels, they were consciousness interfaces, devices for exploring the relationship between the observer and the observed, between the self that looks and the self that is seen looking back. When you gaze into an obsidian mirror by firelight, the experience is fundamentally different from looking into modern glass. The surface seems to have depth, seems to contain worlds within worlds, seems to reflect not just your physical appearance, but aspects of consciousness that normally remain hidden. The Olmec understood mirrors as portals, windows between different levels of reality, the careful placement of mirror fragments in burials, the ritualized destruction of mirrors in ceremonial contexts, the elaborate protocols surrounding their creation and use. All of this points towards sophisticated technologies for consciousness exploration that used reflection as a method for transcending the ordinary boundaries of selfhood. Think about the implications of this for understanding Olmec psychology. These people didn't just look at the world, they looked through it, into it, recognizing layers of meaning and significance that our materialist worldview has trained us to ignore. Every object, every natural phenomenon, every human interaction was simultaneously practical and symbolic, functional and sacred, immediate and eternal. The cocoa that grew wild in their forests wasn't just a food source. It was a consciousness-altering substance, a plant teacher that could induce visions, provide insights, facilitate communication with non-ordinary states of reality. The Olmec were the first people to domesticate cocoa, to develop techniques for processing it into drinks that served both nutritional and spiritual purposes. When Spanish conquistadors first encountered chocolate among the Maya and Aztec, they were witnessing the end result of a 3,000-year tradition of consciousness exploration that began in Olmec laboratories. The same pattern appears with other plants, other substances, other technologies that the Olmec pioneered. They weren't just developing practical solutions to material problems. They were developing tools for consciousness research, methods for exploring the full spectrum of human awareness, techniques for maintaining the expanded states of perception that made their impossible achievements not just possible, but inevitable. The writing system they developed reflects this integration of practical and transcendent concerns. Olmec glyphs aren't just phonetic symbols or pictographic representations. They're consciousness triggers, visual patterns designed to evoke specific states of awareness in anyone who knows how to read them correctly. Each symbol carries multiple layers of meaning, multiple levels of significance that unfold gradually as the reader's consciousness expands to accommodate increasingly subtle information. This is why Olmec writing appears so sporadically in the archaeological record, and why it seems to disappear rather than evolving into more complex systems like Maya hieroglyphs. It wasn't meant to record historical events or encode practical information. It was meant to serve as a consciousness interface, a technology for transmitting states of awareness rather than factual data. When the consciousness capable of activating these symbols was no longer available, the writing system became dormant, waiting for minds capable of reactivating its deeper functions. The trade networks that carried Olmec influence throughout Mesoamerica weren't just commercial relationships. They were consciousness transmission systems, networks for sharing the technologies and techniques that made expanded awareness possible. Olmec merchants weren't just carrying jade and obsidian and rubber balls to distant markets. They were carrying knowledge, carrying practices, carrying the living seeds of consciousness, transformation that would take root in new environments and eventually flower into the great civilizations that followed. But here's what makes the Olmec story so unsettling when you really think about it. They developed all of this, achieved all of this, created technologies for consciousness exploration that we're only beginning to understand, and then they walked away from it. Not because they failed, not because they were conquered, not because they exhausted their resources or faced environmental collapse. They walked away because they were finished, because they had accomplished what they set out to accomplish, because they no longer needed the external supports that had carried them through their experimental phase. The colossal heads staring out over empty plazas aren't monuments to dead rulers. Their graduation certificates evidence that the consciousness-raising project succeeded, that the people who carved those faces had achieved the states of awareness the faces represent. Once you become the thing you're trying to create, why would you need to keep creating representations of it? The buried mosaic floors and underwater jade offerings aren't lost treasures or mysterious rituals. They're completion ceremonies, final installations of technologies that had served their purpose and could now be integrated into the planetary consciousness grid that the Olmec had spent centuries constructing. The objects weren't hidden or destroyed. They were deployed, positioned where they could continue serving their original functions without requiring human maintenance or oversight. The abandoned cities aren't evidence of collapse or failure. They're evidence of transcendence, of a civilization that evolved beyond the need for physical infrastructure because it had learned to work directly with the consciousness that infrastructure was designed to focus and amplify. The Olmec didn't disappear. They graduated, moving into ways of being that don't require stone monuments or ceremonial centres, because they had internalized the principles those external forms were created to teach. And they left us the instruction manual, not in books, not in written records, but in the technologies themselves. The ball courts that still generate consciousness-altering acoustics, the astronomical alignments that still connect earthly events to celestial patterns, the mirrors that still serve as portals between different levels of reality, the jade offerings that still maintain whatever cosmic balance they were designed to preserve. All of it still functional, still active, still available to anyone who develops the consciousness capable of recognizing what it is and how it works. The Olmec didn't build monuments to themselves. They built tools for us, technologies for consciousness development that would remain dormant until human awareness evolved enough to reactivate them. The question isn't what happened to the Olmec. The question is whether we're ready to become what they became, whether we're prepared to take the next step in the consciousness evolution they initiated 3,000 years ago in the swamps of Veracruz. Because the invitation is still there, carved in stone, encoded in jade, resonating in the acoustic chambers they built to amplify human awareness beyond the limits of individual consciousness. The ball is still bouncing, the mirrors are still reflecting, the astronomical alignments are still connecting earth to sky with mathematical precision. The only thing that's missing is us, and our willingness to remember what we forgot when we decided that consciousness and matter exist in separate realms. But maybe that's changing. Maybe that's why we're finding their sites now, why their mysteries are becoming visible to archaeological investigation just when our own civilization is beginning to question the materialist assumptions that have dominated our thinking for centuries. Maybe the timing isn't coincidental. Maybe the Olmec technologies are reactivating because human consciousness is finally ready to recognize what they are and how they work. Maybe the real Olmec legacy isn't in the past at all. Maybe it's in the future, in the expanded states of awareness that become possible when we stop limiting ourselves to the narrow bandwidth of perception that our current civilization mistakes for the full spectrum of human potential. Maybe the colossal heads aren't looking backward toward dead ancestors. Maybe they're looking forward toward descendants who will remember how to see through eyes that aren't constrained by the illusion that awareness and reality exist in separate domains. Maybe the first cities of Mesoamerica weren't the beginning of something that ended. Maybe they were the beginning of something that's just beginning, something that requires our participation to reach completion, something that's been waiting 3,000 years for enough human beings to remember what the Olmec never forgot. That consciousness is the fundamental force that shapes reality. That human intention can influence cosmic processes through focused attention and collective ritual activity, that the boundaries between mind and matter are far more permeable than our science admits, that the universe itself is conscious and responsive to conscious beings who know how to work with its principles rather than against them. The Olmec proved this was possible. They demonstrated it, they documented it in stone and jade and acoustic resonance, and then they moved on to whatever comes next. But they left the doors open, the technologies active, the invitation extended. All we have to do is remember how to walk through doorways that exist in dimensions our three-dimensional thinking has trained us not to see. All we have to do is remember that we're not separate from the universe we're trying to understand, that consciousness isn't something that happens inside our skulls, but something we participate in, something we can learn to work with directly, something that connects us to forces and intelligences and possibilities that make the Olmec achievements look like elementary exercises in what human beings are actually capable of when they stop limiting themselves to purely material concerns. The swamps of Veracruz are still there. The colossal heads are still staring. The jade offerings are still maintaining whatever balance they were created to preserve. And somewhere in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to discover, the Olmec are still there too, still working with the same consciousness, technologies they pioneered 3,000 years ago, still waiting for the rest of us to remember that reality is far stranger, far more malleable, far more responsive to human awareness than our materialist philosophy allows us to believe. Still waiting for us to catch up, still waiting for us to come home. The rubber ball game wasn't the only acoustic technology the Olmec developed. Walk through the ruins of La Venta today and you'll discover something that makes acoustic engineers scratch their heads in bewilderment. Hidden beneath centuries of jungle growth are stone chambers, precisely carved underground spaces that function as resonance amplifiers on a scale that shouldn't be possible with Paleolithic tools. These aren't natural caves that were modified for human use. These are engineered spaces carved from solid bedrock with mathematical precision, designed to capture and manipulate sound waves in ways that our modern understanding of acoustics says should require computer modelling and electronic equipment. The walls curve at specific angles, the ceiling heights follow exact ratios, the floor surfaces are polished to degrees of smoothness that affect how sound reflects and travels through the space. Stand in one of these chambers and whisper against the eastern wall. Your voice will travel through channels carved into the stone, emerge from openings you can't see, and return to you as a chorus of echoes that seem to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. Clap your hands and the sound transforms into rhythmic pulses that synchronize with your heartbeat, that create standing wave patterns you can feel in your chest cavity, that induce states of consciousness. Modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. The Olmec weren't just building spaces for ritual activities, they were constructing instruments, architectural devices that used sound itself as a technology for consciousness transformation. Every major ceremonial center had these acoustic chambers, positioned according to principles that integrated sound engineering with astronomical alignments and mythological geography. They weren't afterthoughts or luxury amenities. They were essential components of the consciousness-raising infrastructure that made Olmec civilization possible. But why? Why invest such enormous effort in perfecting acoustic technologies that served no obvious practical purpose? The answer, when you really think about it, is both simple and profound. The Olmec understood something about the relationship between sound and awareness that we've forgotten in our rush toward visual technologies and written communication. Sound doesn't just carry information. Sound creates reality. The frequencies that vibrate through your eardrums, don't just deliver messages to your brain. They reorganize your neural activity, they synchronize your brain waves with external rhythms, they can induce altered states as reliably as any pharmaceutical compound. The Olmec developed acoustic technologies that use these principles deliberately, systematically, as tools for expanding human consciousness beyond its normal limitations. Consider what this means for understanding their religious practices. When Olmec priests gathered in those underground resonance chambers, they weren't just performing rituals or reciting prayers, they were using architectural instruments to generate specific frequencies, specific rhythmic patterns, specific acoustic environments that could shift entire groups of people into synchronized, altered states. The chambers weren't just venues for religious activities, they were consciousness-altering devices, precision-engineered spaces where human awareness could be expanded, focused, directed toward direct perception of cosmic patterns. The mathematical precision required to achieve these acoustic effects tells us something remarkable about Olmec engineering capabilities. Modern acousticians using computer modeling and electronic testing equipment struggle to create resonance chambers as sophisticated as what the Olmec achieved using stone tools and empirical observation. The curves of those walls, the angles of those ceiling surfaces, the proportions of those underground spaces, all of it calculated to produce specific psychological effects in human nervous systems. This wasn't trial and error construction. This wasn't primitive experimentation with interesting acoustic properties. This was applied science, sophisticated understanding of wave mechanics and neural psychology, and the relationships between sound frequencies and states of consciousness. The Olmec weren't just building spaces that sounded interesting. They were building technologies for consciousness research, architectural laboratories, where the full spectrum of human awareness could be explored and mapped and utilized for purposes we're only beginning to understand. The obsidian workshops scattered throughout the Olmec heartland tell a similar story of technological sophistication that transcends our assumptions about what should be possible with Stone Age tools. Obsidian, volcanic glass, is one of the most difficult materials to work with precision. It fractures unpredictably, it's brittle, it requires techniques so subtle that modern knappers spend decades learning to produce blades that approach Olmec quality. And yet Olmec obsidian work is so extraordinary that the blades they produced are still used in modern surgical procedures because they can be made sharper than steel, thinner than razors, with cutting edges that approach the molecular level. How? How did people using stone hammers and bone pressure flakers achieve levels of precision that challenge our best modern manufacturing techniques? The workshops themselves provide clues. These weren't just craft areas where individual artisans produced tools for local use. They were industrial complexes, specialized facilities where teams of workers processed obsidian according to standardized techniques that required institutional knowledge, systematic training, and quality control procedures that ensured consistent results across multiple generations of craftsmen. The debris patterns tell the story. Layers of obsidian flakes sorted by size, shape, and quality. Specialized tools for different stages of the production process. Evidence of heat treatment, controlled fracturing, surface modification techniques that push the properties of volcanic glass to their absolute limits. This wasn't casual craft production. This was precision manufacturing, systematic exploitation of material properties that required scientific understanding of fracture mechanics, thermal dynamics, and the molecular structure of volcanic glass. But here's what makes it even more remarkable. The finished products weren't just functional tools. They were works of art, objects so beautiful that they transcend the boundary between utility and aesthetics. Obsidian mirrors polished to optical perfection, ceremonial blades with edges so sharp they seem to cut light itself, decorative objects that transform volcanic glass into forms that seem to glow within a fire. The Olmec weren't just making tools, they were transmuting matter, transforming raw volcanic glass into objects that served simultaneously as practical implements and consciousness interfaces. An obsidian mirror wasn't just a reflective surface. It was a portal, a window between different levels of reality that could induce visions, facilitate communication with non-ordinary states of awareness, serve as a focal point for rituals that integrated individual consciousness with cosmic intelligence. The precision required to create these objects tells us something profound about Olmec psychology. These people didn't just work with materials, they communicated with them, developing relationships with obsidian and jade and basalt that allowed them to understand the hidden properties of matter, to work with forces that our materialist science doesn't recognize as significant, but that produced results our technology struggles to replicate. This integration of consciousness and matter appears throughout Olmec culture, in their art, their architecture, their technological innovations, their social organization. They weren't just building a civilization, they were conducting experiments in applied consciousness, developing techniques for working directly with the forces that organize reality, at levels our instruments can't measure, but our awareness can participate in when it's properly trained and focused. The jade trade networks that carried Olmec influence throughout Mesoamerica weren't just commercial relationships, they were consciousness transmission systems, networks for sharing the technologies and techniques that made expanded awareness possible. Jade wasn't valuable because it was rare or beautiful, though it was both. Jade was valuable because it served as a storage medium for consciousness, a crystalline matrix that could hold and transmit states of awareness across time and space. Think about the implications of this for understanding Olmec economy. Value wasn't based on scarcity or labor input or market demand. Value was based on consciousness content, on the degree to which an object could serve as an interface between human awareness and cosmic intelligence. The most precious Olmec artifacts weren't treasures in our modern sense. They were technologies, consciousness-altering devices disguised as decorative objects. The jade figurines found in underwater deposits throughout the Gulf Coast region weren't offerings or ritual objects in any conventional sense. They were installations, precision-placed components of a planetary consciousness grid that used water as a transmission medium, that positioned crystalline matrices at specific locations where they could maintain ongoing communication with forces that our science doesn't recognize, but that the Olmec worked with directly. And they're still there, still functional, still maintaining whatever balance they were designed to preserve. 3,000 years later, those jade figurines continue to serve their original purposes, continue to operate according to principles that integrate consciousness and matter in ways our materialist philosophy can't accommodate, but can't prove to be ineffective. The agricultural systems that supported Olmec civilization operated according to the same integrated principles. This wasn't just farming in any recognizable sense. This was ecological partnership, systematic cooperation with plant intelligence, soil consciousness, water spirits, and the seasonal rhythms that govern all growth and transformation. The Olmec didn't just grow crops, they participated in the ongoing creation of abundance, using human intention and collective ritual activity to enhance the natural fertility of landscapes that were already rich beyond anything our modern agriculture can achieve. The raised fields that crisscross the ancient Olmec heartland aren't just evidence of sophisticated hydraulic engineering, they're components of a consciousness agricultural system that integrated water management with astronomical observation, crop rotation with ceremonial calendars, soil chemistry with spiritual practices that enhance the life-giving properties of Earth itself. Modern soil analysis of these ancient field systems reveals something that makes agricultural scientists shake their heads in bewilderment. The soil is still extraordinarily fertile, 3,000 years after the Olmec stopped farming it. Not depleted, not exhausted, not requiring artificial fertilizers or chemical amendments. Still rich, still alive, still more productive than most modern agricultural soils, despite centuries of abandonment. How? How does soil maintain its fertility for 3 millennia without human intervention. The only explanation that makes sense is that the Olmec developed agricultural techniques that enhanced rather than depleted the natural life-generating capacity of the landscape, techniques that worked with soil consciousness rather than against it, that understood farming as a form of partnership with the intelligence that organizes matter into increasingly complex and meaningful forms. This wasn't sustainable agriculture in our modern sense. This was regenerative agriculture, farming practices that actually increased the fertility of the land over time, that left the landscape more alive, more productive, more capable of supporting complex ecosystems than it had been before human intervention. The Olmec weren't just feeding themselves, they were feeding the earth, participating in cycles of reciprocity that enhanced the life-giving capacity of the entire bioregion. The astronomical observation platforms that dominated Olmec ceremonial centers serve similar functions in the realm of time and cosmic awareness. These weren't just calendrical devices for tracking agricultural seasons or predicting eclipses. They were consciousness interfaces, architectural instruments for synchronizing human awareness with the rhythmic patterns that govern all change and transformation in the universe. The precision of Olmec astronomical observations rivals anything achieved by classical civilizations with access to written records and institutional continuity. They tracked Venus cycles, lunar phases, solar variations, and the precession of the equinoxes with mathematical accuracy that shouldn't have been possible without telescopes, without writing systems for recording data, without the accumulated observations of multiple generations of dedicated astronomers. And yet they did it somehow, using methods we can't reconstruct because we can't imagine the kind of consciousness that would make those methods possible. Maybe they didn't need to write down their observations because they could remember them with perfect accuracy. Maybe they didn't need telescopes because they could perceive celestial movements with enhanced awareness. Maybe they didn't need institutional continuity because they could access astronomical information directly from the cosmic patterns themselves. The calendar systems they developed encoded this astronomical knowledge into forms that served simultaneously as timekeeping devices and consciousness-raising technologies. Olmec calendars weren't just ways of measuring duration or scheduling activities. They were maps of eternity, tools for navigating the eternal return of cosmic rhythms, instruction manuals for aligning human consciousness with the forces that govern transformation and renewal throughout the universe. Living according to these calendrical systems meant participating in cosmic consciousness, synchronizing your individual awareness with patterns that connected your personal life to the ongoing creation of reality itself. Every day was sacred, every season was ceremonial, every year was a complete cycle of death and rebirth that required conscious participation to maintain its life-giving potential. This integration of astronomical observation with consciousness development appears throughout Olmec culture, in their architecture, their art, their social organization, their technological innovations. They weren't just studying the sky, they were learning to think like the sky, to perceive reality from the perspective of cosmic intelligence, to participate directly in the forces that organize matter and energy into increasingly complex and meaningful forms. The ceremonial bloodletting that appears in Olmec iconography serves similar functions in the realm of biological consciousness and energy transformation. This wasn't primitive sacrifice or ritual violence. This was precision biotechnology, controlled release of life force energy that could be directed towards specific purposes, specific outcomes, specific alterations in the fabric of reality itself. Blood wasn't just a biological fluid to the Olmec. It was liquid consciousness, concentrated life force that carried information, intention, and transformative potential. When blood was offered ritually, it wasn't just symbolic gesture or religious devotion. It was technology, systematic utilization of biological energy for consciousness-raising purposes that integrated individual awareness with cosmic intelligence. The jade bloodletters found at Olmec sites aren't just ceremonial implements. They're precision instruments, tools designed for controlled release of consciousness energy according to protocols that maximize the transformative potential while minimizing the physical trauma. The shapes, the edge geometries, the surface treatments, all calculated to produce specific effects in biological systems, specific alterations in consciousness states, specific outcomes in the relationship between human awareness and cosmic forces. This understanding of blood as consciousness technology appears throughout Mesoamerican civilization, from the Olmec through the Maya to the Aztec, but it reaches its most sophisticated expression in Olmec practices that integrated bloodletting with astronomical observation, agricultural cycles, and architectural acoustics to create comprehensive technologies for reality transformation. When Olmec priests engaged in ceremonial bloodletting in those underground resonance chambers, timed to coincide with specific astronomical events, positioned according to sacred geographical principles, they weren't just performing religious rituals. They were operating consciousness-altering devices, using biological energy and architectural acoustics and cosmic timing to generate alterations in reality itself, to maintain the balance between human consciousness and cosmic intelligence that kept their entire civilization functioning. And it worked. For over 1,000 years, Olmec civilization thrived in environments that should have been impossible to sustain, using technologies that our science says shouldn't be effective, achieving results that our materialist philosophy says shouldn't be possible. They moved mountains literally and figuratively, using nothing but human consciousness, properly organized and systematically applied. Then they walked away from it all, not because they failed, but because they succeeded, not because they were conquered, but because they completed whatever they had set out to accomplish. The colossal heads staring out over empty plazas aren't monuments to dead rulers. Their graduation certificates, evidence that the consciousness-raising experiment had achieved its intended results. The people who carved those faces, who moved those massive stones, who built those impossible cities, they had become what the faces represent. They had achieved the states of consciousness the monuments were designed to evoke and focus and transmit. Once you become the thing you're trying to create, what need is there for external representations of it? The Olmec didn't disappear. They graduated, moving into ways of being that don't require stone monuments or ceremonial centres, because they had internalized the principles those external forms were created to teach. They transcended the need for physical infrastructure because they had learned to work directly with the consciousness that infrastructure was designed to focus and amplify. But they left the technologies active, the doors open, the invitation extended. The acoustic chambers still generate consciousness-altering resonances. The astronomical alignments still connect earthly events to celestial patterns. The jade offerings still maintain whatever cosmic balance they were designed to preserve. All of it's still functional, still available to anyone who develops the awareness capable of recognizing what it is and how it works. The question isn't what happened to the Olmec. The question is whether we're ready to become what they became, whether we're prepared to recognize that consciousness and matter are not separate phenomena, but two aspects of a single reality that can be shaped through focused intention and collective ritual activity. Because that's the real message encoded in those colossal heads, buried in those mosaic floors, resonating in those acoustic chambers. Reality is far more malleable than we've been taught to believe. Human consciousness is far more powerful than our materialist science admits. The boundaries between mind and matter are far more permeable than our philosophy allows for. The Olmec proved this was true. They demonstrated it, they documented it in stone and jade and acoustic resonance, and then they moved on to whatever comes next. But they left the instruction manual behind, carved in stone, encoded in crystal, resonating in architectural spaces that still function exactly as designed 3,000 years after their creators walked away from them. Still waiting for us to remember what we forgot when we decided that awareness and reality exist in separate domains. Still waiting for us to catch up. still waiting for us to come home. The rubber doesn't tell you its secrets easily. Even today, modern chemists struggle to replicate the exact process the Olmec developed for transforming tree sap into those perfect spheres that defied gravity in ways that seemed almost supernatural. The latex dripping from Castilla elastica trees is sticky, unworkable, more likely to coat your hands in permanent resin than bounce across a stone court. But somehow, using techniques that died with them, the Olmec figured out how to add just the right amount of sulfur, just the right heat, just the right timing to create rubber balls that moved like living things. And they didn't just make one or two experimental prototypes. Archaeological evidence suggests they were producing these balls on an industrial scale in workshops that processed hundreds of pounds of latex according to standardized procedures that required institutional knowledge, systematic training, and quality control measures that ensured every ball met specifications we can barely understand today. The chemical composition, the elasticity coefficients, the precise density ratios, all calculated to produce objects that would behave in specific ways when struck against stone surfaces carved to mathematical tolerances. But here's what makes your skin crawl when you really think about it. The balls weren't just for games, they were for something else, something the Spanish conquistadors witnessed among the Maya and Aztec but couldn't comprehend, something they described in letters back to Europe as diabolic, supernatural, evidence of communication with forces that Christian theology couldn't accommodate. The balls moved wrong, not just bouncing higher than physics should allow, not just maintaining momentum in ways that defied normal material behavior, but responding to human intention in ways that suggested they were conscious, aware, capable of interpreting the thoughts and emotions of the players who worked with them. Spanish observers reported balls that seemed to change direction mid-flight, that bounced towards specific targets as if guided by invisible intelligence, that moved in patterns that corresponded to astronomical events occurring simultaneously in the sky above the courts. This sounds like colonial superstition until you realise that modern materials scientists still can't figure out how the Olmec achieved the chemical properties they embedded in those rubber compounds. X-ray analysis reveals molecular structures that shouldn't be stable, crystalline arrangements that shouldn't form naturally, polymer chains that seem to have been organised according to principles our chemistry textbooks don't recognise as valid. The balls weren't just sports equipment, they were consciousness interfaces, physical objects that had been modified at the molecular level to respond to human awareness in ways that bridged the gap between thought and matter. When an Olmec player focused his intention on a specific trajectory, the ball didn't just follow the laws of physics, it followed the laws of consciousness, moving according to principles that integrated material behaviour with mental activity. Think about what this means for understanding the true sophistication of Olmec technology. They weren't just developing mechanical solutions to practical problems, they were developing consciousness-responsive materials, substances that had been altered at the molecular level to serve as interfaces between human awareness and the forces that govern material behaviour. The rubber balls were just the beginning, the most obvious examples of technologies that operated according to principles our science doesn't recognise but can't prove to be impossible. The ceramic workshops scattered throughout the Olmec heartland produced objects that exhibit similar anomalous properties, pottery that seems to resonate at specific frequencies, vessels that generate subtle electromagnetic fields, containers that preserve organic materials for periods that shouldn't be achievable without chemical preservatives. Not random accidents or lucky coincidences, but systematic applications of techniques that modified clay at the atomic level, that embed as practical tools and technological interfaces, fed consciousness-responsive properties into objects that served simultaneously firing techniques alone, represent achievements that ceramic engineers struggle to replicate using modern kilns and computer-controlled temperature systems. Olmec potters achieved surface treatments, color variations, and structural properties that require precise control of atmospheric conditions, exact timing of heating and cooling cycles, and understanding of chemical processes that wasn't supposed to exist until the development of industrial ceramics in the 19th century. But they did it using wood-fired kilns, organic fuel sources, and empirical observation methods that somehow allowed them to monitor and control molecular-level transformations in clay bodies. The finished products exhibit properties that suggest they were designed not just as containers, but as resonance chambers, acoustic amplifiers, electromagnetic focusing devices that could enhance and direct subtle energies in ways our instruments can barely detect. Some of the most sophisticated Olmec ceramics were found in underwater deposits, placed in springs and cenotes according to the same protocols that govern jade offerings. These weren't discarded pottery or accidentally lost containers. These were precisely positioned technological installations, ceramic devices that had been modified to serve specific functions in aquatic environments, to interact with water-based energy systems in ways that maintained ongoing communication between human consciousness and the intelligence that organizes matter at quantum levels. And they're still there, still functional, still operating according to principles that integrate consciousness and matter in ways our materialist philosophy can't accommodate but can't prove to be ineffective. 3,000 years later, those ceramic installations continue to serve their original purposes, continue to maintain whatever balance they were designed to preserve in the relationship between human awareness and the forces that control the fundamental properties of reality. The weaving technologies developed by Olmec textile workers exhibit the same integration of consciousness and matter that characterizes all their technological innovations. Cotton isn't just plant fiber to people who understand its true properties. Cotton is crystalline matrix, organic conductor, biological antenna that can be modified through specific processing techniques to serve as consciousness-responsive material, fabric that responds to human intention and emotional states in ways that create ongoing feedback between the wearer and the garments. Olmec textiles, what few fragments survive in the humid climate of the Gulf Coast, exhibit weave patterns that seem to follow mathematical sequences, fiber arrangements that create geometric forms identical to those found in their stone carvings and jade sculptures. This wasn't just decorative consistency across different media. This was systematic application of consciousness organizing principles, techniques for embedding the same information patterns into multiple material substrates. The dyes they developed, extracted from plants and minerals using methods that required sophisticated understanding of chemistry, pH balance, and molecular bonding, produced colors that modern textile scientists describe as impossible. Reds that seem to glow with internal light, blues that shift between different hues depending on viewing angle, patterns that appear to move and change when observed under different lighting conditions. These weren't just aesthetic achievements, these were consciousness interfaces, textiles that had been modified to serve as wearable technologies, garments that enhanced the awareness of people who wore them, that facilitated communication between individual consciousness and the cosmic intelligence that governs transformation and renewal throughout the universe. When Olmec priests wore these consciousness-responsive textiles during ceremonies in those acoustic resonance chambers, timed to coincide with specific astronomical events, they weren't just performing religious rituals. They were operating integrated consciousness-altering systems, using wearable technology and architectural acoustics and cosmic timing to generate states of awareness that transcended the normal limitations of individual consciousness. The mathematical principles that guided all these technological developments appear most clearly in the astronomical calculations that governed Olmec's ceremonial activities. Their calendar systems encoded not just timekeeping information, but consciousness-organizing algorithms, mathematical sequences that synchronized human awareness with cosmic rhythms in ways that enhanced the effectiveness of all their other technologies. The Venus cycles they tracked with such precision weren't just astronomical phenomena to be observed and recorded. Venus was consciousness beacon, celestial intelligence that transmitted information about the optimal timing for consciousness-raising activities, about the periods when the barriers between different levels of reality became most permeable, when human intention could achieve maximum effect in reshaping material conditions. The eclipse predictions they made centuries in advance weren't just demonstrations of mathematical sophistication. Eclipses were consciousness events, moments when the normal relationship between solar and lunar intelligence shifted dramatically, when the electromagnetic environment of Earth changed in ways that enhanced the effectiveness of consciousness technologies, when rituals and ceremonies could achieve results that were impossible under normal conditions. Every major Olmec ceremonial event was timed to coincide with these consciousness-enhancing astronomical phenomena, creating synchronized activation of all their technologies simultaneously. The acoustic chambers, the consciousness-responsive materials, the electromagnetic focusing devices, the water-based communication systems, all operating together during periods when cosmic conditions were optimized for consciousness-matter interaction. This wasn't primitive astrology or superstitious ritual timing. This was applied science, systematic utilization of natural cycles and electromagnetic phenomena to enhance the effectiveness of consciousness technologies that operated according to principles our mainstream science doesn't recognize, but our quantum physicists are beginning to rediscover. The agricultural systems that supported this technological infrastructure operated according to the same integrated principles. Olmec farming wasn't just about growing crops. It was about participating in the ongoing creation of abundance, using human intention and consciousness technologies to enhance the natural fertility of landscapes in ways that modern agriculture can't achieve even with chemical fertilizers and genetic modification. The raised field systems that still crisscross the ancient Olmec heartland weren't just sophisticated water management projects. They were consciousness agricultural installations, engineered landscapes that integrated hydraulic engineering with electromagnetic focusing, soil chemistry with consciousness organizing principles, crop rotation with ceremonial calendars that synchronized agricultural activities with cosmic timing. The crops they grew weren't just food sources, but consciousness-enhancing plants, varieties that had been developed through selective breeding and consciousness-assisted cultivation to serve simultaneously as nutrition and technology. Maize varieties that contained specific amino acid sequences, beans that produced alkaloids with consciousness-altering properties, squash that served as natural containers for storing and transmitting subtle energies. So here we are, 3,000 years later, still finding pieces of what they left behind, still digging colossal heads out of jungle mud and wondering how they moved 20-ton blocks of stone across 50 miles of swampland using nothing but human hands and mathematical precision, still measuring the acoustic properties of their ball courts and discovering resonance chambers that shouldn't be possible with Paleolithic tools. The Olmec didn't disappear because they failed. They walked away because they succeeded, because they had become what those stone faces represent, because they no longer needed monuments to remind them what human consciousness was capable of when it stopped limiting itself to purely material concerns. Their cities fell silent, but the technologies are still active. The jade offerings still rest in dark water, still maintaining whatever cosmic balance they were designed to preserve. The astronomical alignments still connect earthly events to celestial patterns with the same precision that guided their ceremonies 3 millennia ago. The colossal heads still stare out through jungle vines, still carrying the same information, still waiting for minds capable of recognizing what they are and how they work. Maybe that's why we're finding them now, just when our own civilization is beginning to question whether consciousness and matter really exist in separate domains. Maybe the timing isn't coincidental. Maybe the Olmec encoded their essential insights into forms so durable so precisely calibrated that they would survive any amount of cultural forgetting and still be available when human awareness evolved enough to activate them again. The swamps of Veracruz are still there. The rubber ball courts still generate consciousness-altering acoustics. The mirrors still reflect more than just physical appearances. All of it still functional, still waiting for us to remember that reality is far stranger, far more malleable, far more responsive to human intention than our materialist philosophy allows us to believe. The Olmec built the first cities in the Americas and then became something else entirely, something that transcends the need for stone monuments because it learned to work directly with the consciousness those monuments were designed to evoke. They're still here, in the spaces between what we think we know and what we're afraid to discover, still waiting for the rest of us to catch up, still waiting for us to come home.